my screen now?
Yes, your screen is visible.
Oh, here.
Okay, great. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is measuring farmland biodiversity. This is part of a project called Trees on Farms, which is supported by ICI in the German government. And it has a number of partners. I'm representing the World Agroforestry, but we also have partners from C4, from Cartier, and from IUCN. You'll be hearing from Adriana at IUCN later. Okay.
Are you also able to make that full screen, Rhett?
What I'm sharing is full screen, so you're not seeing the full screen.
Okay.
Is it? What are you seeing at the moment?
No. I'm just taking up a corner of the screen, but I think it's okay, especially because technologically I don't really have a solution for you. I think it's in the way that it gets shared, full screen or not. But yeah, it's okay.
Full screen, but
Okay.
yeah, for us, yeah.
Okay. All right. Are you now seeing slide 2, the background slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So let us just talk a little bit about why it's interesting to look at farmland biodiversity. So if we go back to to 2000, we had the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which estimated that about 60% of ecosystem services were impaired. And looking at agricultural land, we have about 20% of agricultural land today globally is degraded, and as much as 40% in sub-Saharan Africa. We can also acknowledge that agricultural expansion is a major driver of biodiversity loss, not of biodiversity loss. And deforestation and land use change account for about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, actually, globally. But this often extends to roughly about 80% in many developing countries. So it's a major contributor to climate change as well. Okay, so looking specifically at farmland biodiversity, measuring biodiversity on farms is challenging for a number of reasons. First of all, the benefits of biodiversity are very dependent on the abundance, diversity, and distribution of that of components of biodiversity. There's very high spatial variability, which makes, for example, if we see on the left there, a single crop in it has very low biodiversity, but equally of habitat biodiversity in that biome. So you have very, very high spatial variability in levels that you will measure. Then for on social outcome and biodiversity. So be able to measure the biodiversity at a fine scale and update it regularly. I'm getting a little bit of echo. I don't know if some people can switch off their microphones.
Yeah, we need to make sure people mute your microphone, please.
Okay, on the role of biodiversity, I have a couple of slides here that I just want to introduce. Of course, there's a huge literature on how biodiversity functions. There have been over 500 experiments showing that increasing biodiversity increases ecosystem function. Most of these experiments are mesocosm experiments or microcosm experiments in grasslands or in small water mesocosms. But they're experiments, and they demonstrate very clearly that increasing biodiversity increases ecosystem functioning. What we have in this paper was a study that looked across a meta-study of the experiments. Looked at how was the role of environmental is that as different and this is exactly what we would predict from niche theory. That basically, as the heterogeneity of the environment becomes higher, the role of biodiversity in delivering an ecosystem function becomes more important. So, for example, take the top one there, which is parasitoid richness and parasitism rate. So the bottom line, which is almost flat, so there's almost no relationship, would be a situation in which you have perhaps one pest, or maybe one life history stage of one pest. But as the host heterogeneity increases, you have more species of pests, more life history stages of pests. The parasitoid richness becomes more important in delivering parasitism as a pest control function. And we have a very similar relationship down on the bottom there for pollination. The more types of crops or types of flowers that you need pollinated, the more pollinator richness becomes important. And this is a study by Duffy et al. That was published in Nature a couple of years back. And I think this is also very interesting to reflect on. So what they did is they looked at, it's a meta-analysis. They looked at studies of the role of biodiversity across natural ecosystems. So these are forests, lakes, streams, and so forth, not managed ecosystems. But what they did is they looked at the importance of biodiversity, and they discovered that it was very important, as the experimental studies had also demonstrated. But what they did here is they ranked the importance of biodiversity against, on the left there, climate predictors, and on the right, nutrient predictors. So if we look, and so what you're seeing there is the rank 1, rank 2, and rank 3 for biodiversity. So in a majority of studies, biodiversity was more important than climate predictors, than any of the climate predictors they looked at. And again, in a majority of studies, biodiversity was more important in nutrient predictors in delivering the ecosystem function. And I think this is very important to reflect upon, because when we look at our agricultural systems, if you were to go and tell a farmer that they could ignore climate or they could ignore nutrients, they would think you were crazy. And yet our management of agricultural systems in this sort of standard industrial model completely ignores the role of biodiversity. And I think this is a very telling result and shows us why it's important that we need to start considering biodiversity in our agricultural landscapes. So what have we done to develop these protocols for measuring biodiversity? Well, in the first instance, we've taken a large scale. So we have to recognize that the spatial distribution of biodiversity is very heterogeneous in these landscapes. So we need to have a large-scale perspective on it. So we have developed this protocol where we take a square that is 25 kilometers wide by 25 kilometers tall. And then we subsample that so that we take one 5 kilometer by 5 kilometers square, two of these 5 by 5 kilometer squares in each row and each column, which gives us a 40% sample of that 25 by 25 kilometer squared landscape. And we've developed a kind of tiered sampling thing where we have basic protocols that are supposed to be sampled in every study that uses this set of protocols. And that includes land cover. So that's an assessment on the plot scale where the observer records the different aspects such as the topography, the land cover classes, and so forth. And then we do a survey of the trees, and we do a survey of the birds. Why did we select trees? Well, we wanted to select a component of biodiversity that we could observe with remote sensing, because ultimately we want to outscale these observations using remote sensing. So the idea is to use the trees to understand the distribution of biodiversity and then link that to the bird diversity or other components that we might measure optionally. So this is where the modeling of the remote sensing data comes in. So here's some slides. So for the trees, we're using 1 hectare circular plots. That can be a little bit challenging where you have to put them in forests. So in forests, actually, we've reduced it to a 1/2 hectare so that you can actually see the center of the plot. But in open landscapes, it's quite easy to do a hectares plot. And then for the birds, we use 30-meter radius point counts with multiple visits, obviously, so that we get a good coverage of the bird community. We have a whole series of optional protocols, and obviously we're quite open to introducing more. These are protocols that practitioners would use in a particular area when they have a particular interest in having some data on these components. So one of the protocols we have here is on linear features. If we look at the map, this is actually a map from Honduras in Central America, and you can see that the tree linear features are a very important component of this landscape. The farmers typically plant trees on field boundaries and along roads and so forth. And so to miss out the tree linear features would be to miss a big component of the biodiversity of this landscape. So we have a protocol for sampling those. And then we have a protocol, it's actually a combined protocol for doing pollinators and natural enemies. And we have protocols for looking at soil organisms, which is in line with the GeoBon Global Soil Survey. The picture here shows you our method for surveying pollinators and natural enemies. We use a combined pitfall pan trap method. So pan traps are quite good, especially for bees and other pollinators. You use these three colors, and the pollinators simply, they get attracted to them like a flower and they fall in. But then if you bury these in the ground, then you also get a large number of crawling insects as well, which gives you good coverage of your natural enemies. So we use these this combined type of trap. And as I said, the aim is to look at these data with remote sensing. And this is still a work in progress, but as you can see, we have this is data from Mount Elgon in Uganda, and you can see that the R squared for the biomass map was 0.75, and that's at the pixel scale. If you take larger scales, like say 100 meters by 100 meters, you would get a much higher R squared. So an R squared at a pixel scale of, this is Sentinel, so it's just about 10 meters squared, is very good. And likewise with tree composition. On the first axis, we get a very high R squared. That the first axis correlates mostly with the transition from forest to non-forest habitats. A slightly lower R squared on the second axis there, but still respectable, considering again that we're working at a very small pixel scale here. So what do we do then with data? So one of the things we want to look at is, for example, to take components of the tree data, such as, in this case, I'm looking at above ground biomass, and link that to the bird data from the same plots. Now, I want to point out that this is just at a plot scale. So what I'm not capturing, I'm capturing alpha diversity here. I'm not capturing beta diversity. And beta diversity is also something, of course, we're going to be interested in. But nevertheless, as a way of capturing, what we're going to do here is to link the tree components to the bird diversity or the pollinator diversity, whatever else we're looking at, so that we can then link that through our remote sensing to broad scale assessments at landscape scales. So what are the next steps that we want to do with this approach? Well, basically, we've done surveys in 5 landscapes in Indonesia, in Uganda, Rwanda, Honduras, in 4 landscapes, and we will do a 5th in Peru as soon as COVID allows us. So we will have these surveys done across 5 landscapes in 5 countries. We then have to start looking at the data and crunching the data and seeing what patterns we can get. So one of the things we want to do is look at the landscape factors. There's quite a good literature and some good analytical packages looking at how you can look at things like connectivity, and, fragment size, fragment number, fragment distribution, and so forth, and how that affects this, biodiversity. And in fact, one of the things that you could say that through our work, what we're trying to do is to nuance those existing approaches, because currently those approaches tend to take the landscape as basically being binary. Either you have a natural forest or you have something else. And obviously that's not very realistic, and especially where you're in highly managed landscapes as you would get in Rwanda. So largely what we are trying to do is to nuance those analytical approaches so that they consider the nature of the matrix between the forest fragments. And then another novel approach is to look at multi-species modeling. There have been, occupancy modeling is something that has been around for a while, but it can only be done at relatively large scales. However, in the last 2 to 3 years, there's been a series of papers come out on using multivariate modeling to model species communities using hierarchical models. So this is something we can also try and apply to this method and see if we can't get some more interesting insights. And then I've listed a few problems here with doing these kinds of analysis. The first and perhaps most obvious is that land use is non-random. So when we went to, for example, the Gishwati landscape in Rwanda, what you have is you have a natural forest on top of the hill, and then you have some pastures, and then you have some arable land, and so on, and maybe some woodlots as well. So the biodiversity that we get on top of the hill in the forest is obviously not the same as we would get in a natural forest at the bottom of the hill, and so on. So this landscape non-randomness in the distribution of your habitats creates problems in terms of predicting, for example, what would happen if we tried to create a natural forest at the bottom of the hill. Because obviously it would not be as a forest on the hill. It would probably contribute far more biodiversity than the forest on top of the hill, because it would represent a very habitat that's very rare in that landscape. And then we have a problem of extinction debt. And this is really something that's quite difficult to get a grasp on. When natural habitats are fragmented, there's a period of time when the habitat area is reduced, but you still have species in that habitat or in that landscape that have not yet gone extinct. They are destined to become extinct, locally extinct in that habitat. And this is very difficult to estimate. We can't essentially estimate it from a one point in time survey. We would have to take multiple surveys in order to estimate how quickly the species become extinct in different types of habitat. So that's a challenge to using these kinds of surveys. And then the last challenge is what is the relative importance of other drivers of biodiversity loss? So, for example, hunting, if we're talking about particularly mammals and birds, or pesticides if we're looking at insects. Obviously, these really affect the biodiversity in any landscape we see, but we have very little. We probably have very limited information about the extent of, for example, hunting and what that might be doing to reducing the mammal diversity in a landscape. And in some cases, it may be more important than the habitat loss. There are, for example, habitats in southern India where people don't traditionally hunt. They tend to be vegetarian, and they have a high tolerance of animals in their landscape. And you have agroforestry landscapes with very little natural forest, and yet you still have elephants and leopards and tigers and all sorts of things running around in these landscapes. We go to, a landscape in sub-Saharan Africa or in Southeast Asia where you have traditional hunting communities. And, even in extensive forests, it's sometimes very difficult to see rarer animals. So often the main drivers of biodiversity losses are not, in fact, habitat-based drivers. And obviously, the methods that we're using focus on habitat. So we have to keep that in mind. So this is the last slide I have, and as a spin-off for this work, and following with the CBD's post-2020 agenda, we've been looking at the possibility of developing a global indicator for farmland biodiversity. So we're tentatively naming it the Farmland Biodiversity Score. And this is a work in progress. These who will work on this project is not starting until next month. But this is the concept of it. We use a global mass, and biomass we correlates with the abundance and size of trees on farms and vegetation in general. So that's a good measure of habitat. And then we will look at spectral diversity. That's spectral diversity of the remote sensing images. So spectral diversity, there's a number of papers that show the spectral diversity is correlated to species diversity at different scales. It's, at large scales, it's correlated to the diversity of habitats and different types of vegetation at a landscape. And then at local scales, it will actually correlate to, for example, the number of different tree species or plant species in a habitat. It saturates quite quickly, so it doesn't do so well in diverse forest. But in low diversity environments, it seems to do much better. And obviously, farmland is a relatively low diversity environment. So we're hoping that this will be a fairly good indicator of the species diversity. And then having taken those two basic measures, we want to weigh the scores by the neighborhood. We're envisaging that we weight these scores by the neighborhood of pixels around them. So that, for example, by other high biomass pixels. So obviously, a very tiny amount is score as well as one that has, also has pixels with high biomass around it. And then we also want to weigh pixels by their ecosystem function, and we've identified slope, so that the steeper the slope, the higher the weighting would be, so that we're protecting steep slopes, and by proximity to rivers and streams. So obviously the gallery forest and the buffer zones along water courses being important by areas. So at the bottom we've got a tentative proposed formula. Obviously, it's a very simple formula. With but it is important that indicate to policymakers in a very simple way. So it's just a question of adding the biomass and spectral diversity scores and then multiplying them by the two weights, the weight for neighborhood and the weight for the ecosystem function. And we believe that we can probably produce this indicator at about 100 meter pixel scale. Okay, so I think that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions when we get to that point.
All right, thank you so much. I think it would be worth it to have a set of questions now, and we can keep that to maybe like 5 minutes, and then we'll go to the next talk. Is that okay? And then at the end, when we do questions for Adriana, there may be more mixed in that we didn't get to. So if you would like to ask a question of Rhett now while his talk is fresh on your mind, you can go ahead and unmute, or you can type it into the chat room. Or we can go on with the next talk and we can accumulate the questions and comments. Anybody have anything they want to ask right now? Well, if not, if that's okay with you, Adriana, we'll move on and have you talk. And Adriana's going to talk about the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So thank you so much for joining us, and feel free, everybody, to put in your questions into the chat room for either Rhett or Adriana. We'll have some time at the end of Adriana's talk to have a nice discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, would somebody confirm that you are able to watch the slide full screen?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, awesome. All right, thank you very much for the introduction. Indeed, this presentation is going to be from a different perspective, and in many ways is connected to what Rhett was explaining before, particularly the last part of the farmland biodiversity score, and how the Trees on Farms project is trying to advocate and advance key messages around trees on farms at the CBD in the current post-2020 biodiversity framework conversations and discussions. This presentation will cover a couple of things. First, it will provide a quick overview of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework itself. Just if people are not completely familiar with it, I'm sure that everybody has heard of it, but I just wanted to share a couple of elements so you keep in mind about how is this going to go about in the next months, and the different opportunities for non-state or non-parties of the CBD to get involved into these conversations, and how, well, the Trees on Farms team is doing exactly that. And then the second part of the presentation is going to be more in the details of how we are connecting this work on indicators, this work on key messages with this post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So let's start. What you see here is a diagram that was developed by the open-ended working group for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The group created to lead the process for the formulation of this framework. This diagram was shared by this open-ended working group in February this year. And the idea is that the framework applies a theory of change approach, which requires transformative actions to put in place tools and solutions for implementation, mainstreaming of biodiversity into productive sectors, and conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. These actions need to be supported by enabling conditions and adequate means of implementation, including financial resources, capacity, and technology. This approach also assumes that progress needs to be monitored in a transparent and accountable manner with adequate stock-taking exercises. It also acknowledges the need for appropriate recognition of women's empowerment and the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. Of course, the implementation of these actions would require partnership and collaboration with many organizations at the global, national, and local levels all across the world. So what you see here is what you can call a bit an outdated diagram. Unfortunately, the open-ended working group hasn't posted anything new. I'm saying outdated because recently there was another, and I will explain later, there has been an updated list of goals and targets that change things a little bit. But overall, the draft includes 4 long-term goals for 2050 related to, first, ecosystem integrity, connectivity, and resilience, including species conservation and genetic diversity. Second goal, nature's benefits to people, contributing to improved nutrition, access to water, resilience to natural disasters, and achieving the targets of the Paris Agreement. Third, fair and equitable benefit sharing from the use of genetic resources and traditional knowledge. And fourth, means of implementation. So as you can see, the 2030 mission is to take urgent action, urgent actions across society to put biodiversity on a path to recovery for the benefit of the planet and people. Now, and this will contribute to achieving the 2050 mission. This sounds like a lot of words, but in practice, these topics are going to be discussed in the technical bodies of the CBD. The first technical body is the body focused on implementation, the subsidiary body on implementation, and they are going to discuss in November the topics that are highlighted in orange regarding means of implementation, enabling conditions, responsibility, and transparency. Whereas the other subsidiary body, technical and technological advice, will focus on the components of the framework, advice on goals and targets, indicators, availability of baseline data, and advice and links with the SDGs. This is a lot to cover for sure, but now let me share with you a little bit of the timeline about how this is going to happen. This timeline was shared by the open-ended working group, the one that I mentioned before, that is leading the process, and it shows the following. It shows the timeline for 2020 and 2021. This doesn't mean that the process started this year. Last year, there were meetings where there were a lot of discussions on the potential elements of the framework. There were a lot of thematic consultation. Actually, 8 thematic consultations already took place in topics on topics such as access and benefit sharing, biosafety, restoration, marine and coastal environment, area-based conservation measures, etc. So for this year, what we have? What we have is the following. The open-ended, there are a couple of 3 documents that are up for peer review at the moment. The peer review process is open, and I will explain this in a little bit. The idea is that once that process closes sometime in August, 15th of August, the open-ended working group will work on the comments received, and then they will publish a new set of a complete draft of the global biodiversity framework, not for review, but in preparation for the meetings that are going to happen in November. So one thing to keep in mind is that on the screen, you see a lot of indications of meetings that are thematic consultations, basically, and the subsidiary body meetings. In short, this year, the main meeting for generating technical advice where non-parties have a role is at the SABSTA and at the SBI meetings, which will happen in November. So where the Trees on Farms team is working towards achieving or generating some influencing, knowledge generation, and advocacy around the topics of Trees on Farms that I'll explain in a minute. So as I was saying before, there is a peer review process open to everybody. And if people are interested in contributing from the organizations you belong to or as an individual, you could contribute with input regarding these 3 elements. And the monitoring framework of the Post-2020 biodiversity framework. This basically has the monitoring elements of, for sure, indicators proposed and the baseline data. So, for instance, if you don't think that, or if you think that a monitoring element is missing to measure the achievement of target X, you can suggest new monitoring elements. If you know of an indicator that is not included in the draft, then you can put it forward with, background information about the status of this indicator, whether it's ready to use, etc. So there are also two other peer review processes, one on the Post-2020 and SDG linkages document, and one on the information document shared by UNEP WCMC and the Biodiversity Indicator Partnership. So the Trees on Farm team is provided the third document. Go through the details of our input, but these slides will be shared with all of you for you to check. But basically what we are trying to do is we have tried to contribute to the discussions about indicators and the need to improve the monitoring elements that are considered to measure the achievement of certain targets. So for instance, as you can see in the table, we think that measuring farmland, measuring the impacts of biodiversity or the benefits of biodiversity brought by a more sustainable agricultural system, for instance, that has a larger presence of trees, that could help with reducing ecosystem fragmentation, that could improve connectivity aspects, definitely can help with degradation issues, and absolutely can help with genetic diversity of domesticated species, as well as with bringing biodiversity elements into managed landscapes. So this is not just an exercise of writing down the monitoring elements and indicators, whatever we think is a good idea, but we have to express in our inputs how this could help measuring the targets that parties and non-parties are currently discussing. One thing to be kept in mind is that Red mentioned that this indicator is being developed. That is correct. However, we are also in parallel applying for this indicator in the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership, which is a key player at the CBD because it informs the parties about availability of indicators that are peer-reviewed, that are consistent, and anyway, that gives us a lot of ideas that could be taken up by parties. Similarly, we have also provided input to the monitoring framework itself with the same ideas, basically. I will just skip these details, but please, in the question and answer section, I will be more than happy to go into the details of this. But basically, it's that we have identified specific targets where monitoring elements such as fermentation, trends in woody biomass, and so on could be everything we are formulating. Now, what are the next steps? Although there is a peer review process open at the moment, which I said before, the deadline to receive input is on August 15. The peer review process is not related to the goals and targets. It's only focused on the monitoring framework, which is monitoring elements and indicators. The reason is because the open-ended working group has informed everybody that the negotiation phase has started. So they are basically cutting a line or drawing a line between the how to receive feedback about the global biodiversity framework itself. So although non-parties and everybody can provide inputs to the monitoring framework with regards to the targets and goals, those will be negotiated at the next open-ended working group meeting, which will happen probably January or at the beginning of February next year. That's why I said before that although the content of the biodiversity framework is not going to be negotiated until that moment in 2021, the key meetings that will have, where we are going to have a good chance of generating influence, is the technical meetings, where they are going to discuss the content of the targets and the goals and provide recommendations for that moment in January or February, where it will. So just very quickly showing here that I'm calling new goals and targets. I shouldn't call new. It's actually updated from the first slide in February. And there are still things that there need to be worked on. Of course, it's by far a perfect set of goals and targets. But as I'm kind of trying to reinforce is that the idea that as observers, we have the responsibility to reach out to our country delegates, for instance, wherever you are from, or as an institution, maybe you can generate influencing strategies to make sure that what is currently in the framework, is improved. Everything is considered. There are, for instance, key issues that need to be improved, such as the lack of reference of a net increase in area connectivity and integrity of ecosystems, which it was before in the previous text, and now it's gone. This is particularly important for countries and non-parties to have the obligation of restore, for instance, or keep a balance between the impacts that they display to biodiversity with actions to prevent or compensate, or if that's the case. Anyway, there are other things that you can check quickly that are happening with the new goals and targets that will be discussed, not negotiated. And finally, I want to say, telling you about before, for the biodiversity as one of the key indicators to measure genetic diversity, landscape connectivity, biodiversity managed landscape. But we are also to forward key messages into the CBD. Is that? So, and this is, by the way, the last thing of my time. Land conversion for agriculture and livestock production is, as you know, one of the biggest drivers of natural ecosystem loss. However, responses at the CBD have been focused on the protection of natural ecosystems as a way to prevent further expansion of agriculture. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that agriculture is dealt under the current Aichi biodiversity targets as a productive sector where sustainable practices need to be expanded, assuming that sustainable use and biodiversity are equate to the same thing. However, what we are that hasn't been enough is the importance of mixed Is needed to recognize the landscape approach as the best way to manage biodiversity, both natural and managed ecosystems. Agricultural land within these landscapes should be managed in a manner that optimizes biodiversity conservation and links protected areas to permit movement of species. And the third key message is that towards the implementation of the Post-2020 biodiversity framework, countries have the opportunity to advance this transformative shift from policies that favor mostly simplified monoculture, conventional agriculture, to policies and measures that incentivize job creation in the COVID aftermath, while promoting actively biodiversity-friendly mixed farming at a level. This is now both incorporation to biodiversity and sustainable source of jobs. And transforms biodiversity. So these are the three key messages that we are trying to convey during the Post-2020 biodiversity framework. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.